Hi there and welcome back to RWS Online. So today I'm talking to you from the rooms section of your practice, and we're talking particularly about permits. So what type of permits do you need if you're going into a medical practice? So there are three types and we'll talk about each individually. So firstly, starting off with signage permit. Now that might sound fairly easy and you might think that's fairly simple. The biggest tip I'd tell you about signage permits is to make sure you get your application in earlier than you even thought you needed to. So people will say, oh, I'll get it in a week or so before I start. Sometimes council can have these permits for 2 to 3 months and drag their heels on them. Other times you can get them back relatively quickly. So a good rule of thumb is to fill it in and get it going at council straight away. An organisation like us can do it on your behalf, so it makes it easier. So what you're going to be required to do for your signage permit is, firstly, you'll be paying a fee to the council. It's a few $100s, it's not that expensive. The second thing that you'll be doing is they'll be asking you what the sign is going to look like. So you're going to have a graphic design of what the sign will eventually look like. A sketch won't do. That will have also the fonts and the colours that you're going to use, and they're also very interested in the illumination. They're interested in the illumination and the size more than anything else. But they'll also ask you things such as what material is the sign made from and so forth. So when you get the signage information, then you have to put this in the application into council. Now, here's some words of warning. So I've talked about getting it in nice and early. Remember that if there's an existing sign there and it's been an existing medical practice, you can replace the sign, but it must be to the same size and dimensions. So people break this rule all the time. They put in a sign that's bigger and so forth. And in all the time we've been going in business, which is, over a decade, it's never been a problem except once. So once a doctor put in a sign that was double the size of a previous sign, spent about $5,000 on a really lovely sign and ended up having to take it down at his expense. And also then he needed the expense or the money to build another sign as well. So don't mess with this. Get your permit and put it in straight away. But if it's in the existing space, that's okay. Council will often say to you that you can, I won't quote the meterage because it does vary now somewhat council to council, but basically they'll say that you can have a certain square meterage of signage. Just remember that if you're putting letters on a backboard, it'll be the size of the backboard that's counted within that square metres. Sometimes people count the individual letters. However, if you're clever and you use 3D letters, which kind of can be an expensive sign though, and not always the right choice for a medical practice, but if you use cut out letters, then it'll only be the square meterage of the actual letter that you've chosen and so forth. So that can be a way of getting around it. But do the right thing, put in an application, put it in nice and early, as long as you've got the type of sign that you're doing, like the materials, the size, and information about the illumination. That'll probably be all that they require. So get that done in your first application, and then you won't have an issue as you move forward. All right, so that moves us on to permit number 2. So permit number 2 is planning. Now the whole issue between planning and building permits is where doctors often get tripped up. So I'm going to give you some helpful hints in relation to this. So you see an old house, maybe it's already been a medical suites, and you go along and you say, is there a permitted use, a permit, in other words, a planning permit for me to be a doctor here? And that might be fine because it was already a pre-existing suites. I do say to you that most councils will have a law that if it hasn't been a medical suites for 7+ years, then you have to reapply. So be careful of that and check that out, because councils vary slightly in how long they allow that to slide for and whatever. So if you're buying a medical suites and it has been a suites time, sometime in the past, find out when that was, so that you don't buy and then realise you have to apply for planning all over again to be a doctor at the suites, permitted use as a medical practitioner. Okay, so you buy the suites and you go, terrific, I can be a medical practitioner, this is wonderful. But what doctors often don't realise is now they have to think about the building permit they're going to need. So if you're not doing anything to the property, you might be putting a lick of paint and some carpet, then you're not heralding off a building permit. But if you do anything of a structural nature at all, even putting in sinks, say, for example, then technically you're supposed to get a building permit. Now, I know what you're saying as you're listening to this. My friend did this and he didn't get a building permit, but he might have broken the rules. You know, I'm here to tell you what the rules are and then you can decide what you do. So in relation to your planning permit, that is, you know, what's outside of the building. Sometimes, depending on the size of the building, you won't need a planning permit at all. It'll be automatic. But always find out and make sure that you've looked into what your local council is saying, or engage planners like us so that we can come and do it for you, and you can make sure that you've ticked all the boxes, particularly before you've signed on the dotted line and handed over your hard-earned cash. So with the planning, as I said, it's everything on the outside. But when it comes to the building permit, they're more interested with the interior works and some exteriors as well, such as ramps and disabled access. Now, so if Mr. Planner has said to you, yeah, you can be a medical practice here, that's terrific, that's fine. But then you go to do some building works and the builder's code says, you know what, you have to put a disabled ramp out the front. Well, that might then void your planning permit. It might or it might not. But often these two departments don't talk to each other. So how do we get past this? Well, what we would do is, if you engaged us to come on site, we would look at it and we would bring our building inspector along with us. And the building inspector would look at it and would tell you all the things that you need to do to comply. So if you want to gut the building and rebuild the internals of the building, how wide do the corridors need to be? How wide and high do the doorways need to be? Even how high do the ceilings need to be is important. So all of those sorts of things the building inspector would be able to herald off. Now, doing this can often save you a lot of money because, one, you might decide, oh my God, this is just all too expensive. I can't change the structure of this, I don't want to. Or you might find that the building inspector will give you some leeway. So the building inspector on one site, for example, we did up a practice some time ago in Thornbury, and the building inspector there said there was an unusual configuration where there was steps in the middle of it was like an old shop, so it wasn't a medical suite. So we got the planning permit, but now we're doing the building, and he said that'll be fine, you really should have a disabled ramp there, but we kind of argued, well, that's going to be offices and no one disabled is going to go up there, so therefore it's not prejudicing against anybody. And he said, okay, as long as you allow provision for a ramp, in other words, you don't close off any of the stairs, and it's wide enough that should you need to later on, you could put in a wheelchair access that could fold down, then I will pass that. Now that saved the doctor $15,000 to $20,000 on that move alone. So those sorts of things are really important. So again, planning is the outside of the building, and just because you've got a planning permit does not mean you're going to get a building permit. All right, going back to planning permits, so how long do they take? Well, how long is a piece of string? Up to 2 years they can take. Councils can go on their merry way and take a long time to get back, and it's out of everybody's hands. Sometimes you can fast track a permit, but that depends on whether you meet certain criteria. Often what I'll say to doctors if they're trying to DIY this process is, well, firstly I'd say don't, because it's too hard, you'll get into too much hot water. It will be cheaper to outsource this to somebody else who's more skilled at it, and you make more money being a doctor. That would be number one. But if they're insistent and they really want to handle it themselves, I'll say to them to go off to council and attend a pre-application hearing. Now, the pre-application hearing or meeting means that you'll meet with one of the planners and they'll tell you the likelihood of whether you'll get a planning permit to be a doctor in this space. So that'll be things like impact on the local community. They might ask you to do a traffic report, for example, to see what that impact would be like, and all those costs are at your own cost. A traffic report, for example, might cost you $1,000 to do. It might be that they need an arborist report and so forth. So they'll ask for weird and wonderful things that you may not have expected. So attending a pre-application hearing can sometimes herald off this, so at least you know, not necessarily a deal breaker, it just means that these are things that you need to consider in your budget before you go in and purchase the property. So car parking is the number one, but there are ways around car parking. So for example, we're just looking at a property at the moment for a doctor and it's near a transport hub. So his council deemed that he doesn't need as many car parks. So it used to be that the ratio was 1 to 5, 2 to 10, 3 to 15 and kind of so on. Now it's changed quite a lot. So find out from your individual council what they're asking you to do. Don't expect that it'll always be exactly the same. If you can't meet the car parking requirements, you can ask your planner, if I was to purchase this property, would I meet the car parking requirements? And if not, would I be eligible for dispensation so I don't need to have as many car parks? So there's a little lesson on the signage permits, the planning permit, lesson on and also then how it translates to the building permit. So, you know, my advice 100% is don't do it yourself, but if you insist, this will give you some tips along the way to try and help the journey to be a lot easier for you. So I hope that's been of help.